Nelson Mandela's powerful condemnation of Bush and the Iraq War. I stand before you today with a heavy heart and an unwavering sense of moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for those who wield tremendous influence on the global stage. The world finds itself at a crossroads, and I cannot remain silent as I witness what I believe to be a fundamental betrayal of the very principles that have guided international diplomacy and peacekeeping for generations. Both President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair are systematically undermining an institution and an ideal that was carefully constructed and nurtured by their own predecessors, leaders who understood the vital importance of multilateral cooperation and collective decision-making in matters that affect the entire human family. What deeply troubles me, and what I believe should trouble every person who values justice and equality, is the apparent disregard these leaders show for the authority and legitimacy of the United Nations, particularly now that the Secretary General happens to be a black man. I cannot help but ask myself, and I ask you to consider as well, whether they would have shown such blatant disrespect and defiance when the Secretary General was white, when the face of international diplomacy bore the complexion they were more comfortable acknowledging as authoritative. The profound implications of their actions extend far beyond the immediate crisis we face regarding Iraq, because what they are essentially teaching the world through their behavior is that any nation, any government that believes it, cannot secure the support it desires through proper diplomatic channels and legitimate international consensus building, is somehow entitled to simply bypass the United Nations entirely and act unilaterally according to its own interests and interpretations of justice. Are they suggesting that we as members of the international community should simply ignore the carefully constructed framework of international law and cooperation that has served as humanity's best hope for preventing the kind of devastating conflicts that marked the earlier decades of the 20th century? Or perhaps they are sending an even more dangerous message, one that essentially declares that because they represent what they consider to be the world's only remaining superpower, they can act as they please, without accountability, without consultation, without regard for the concerns and perspectives of other nations, regardless of how legitimate those concerns might be. Are they teaching us that this is the lesson we should follow, that might makes right? That power alone determines the course of international relations? Or are they claiming some special status, some unique moral authority that exempts them from the very standards and procedures they would demand other nations respect and follow? If we are to speak honestly about which country has committed the most unspeakable atrocities in the world, we cannot ignore the historical record of the United States of America, and we cannot allow selective memory to cloud our judgment when it comes to evaluating moral authority on the international stage. They demonstrate time and again that they simply do not care about human beings, about the lives and suffering of ordinary people who bear no responsibility for the political conflicts that consume their leaders' attention and ambitions. 57 years ago, when Japan was retreating on all fronts, and the outcome of the Pacific War was already determined, the American government made the calculated decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people, men, women, and children, who are still suffering from the devastating effects of those weapons today, generations later. Those bombs were not truly aimed against the Japanese people or the Japanese military. They were aimed against the Soviet Union, a demonstration of American power designed to send a clear message to any potential rival. Look at the destructive capability we possess, and if you dare oppose what we do, if you dare challenge our will, this is what awaits you. The arrogance displayed in that decision, the willingness to sacrifice innocent lives to make a geopolitical point, reveals a moral callousness that should disqualify any nation from claiming the role of global policeman or moral arbiter. Who are they now to pretend that they possess the moral authority to police the world? To determine which governments are legitimate and which should be removed, which peoples deserve protection and which can be sacrificed for broader strategic objectives? What I am condemning, what I believe every person of conscience must condemn, is the spectacle of one power led by a president who demonstrates no foresight, who appears incapable of thinking properly about the long-term consequences of his actions, now wanting to plunge the entire world into what can only be described as a holocaust of violence and instability. The reckless pursuit of military solutions to complex political problems, the willingness to unleash destructive forces without adequate consideration of the human cost, represents everything that the international community has worked to move beyond since the end of the Second World War. However, I find reason for hope in the courage and moral clarity demonstrated by people around the world, especially those within the United States of America itself, who are standing up and opposing their own president's rush to war. The sight of Americans taking to the streets, raising their voices in dissent, refusing to be silent in the face of policies they believe to be morally wrong, reminds me that democracy's greatest strength lies not in the power of those who govern, but in the willingness of ordinary citizens to hold their leaders accountable when those leaders lose their way. I hope that this opposition, this groundswell of moral concern and political resistance, will one day help President Bush understand that he has made what may well be remembered as the greatest mistake of his life in trying to bring about carnage and destruction, in attempting to police the world without any legitimate authority from the international body that represents humanity, his collective commitment to peace, justice, and cooperation. What we are witnessing is something that we must condemn without reservation, without qualification, and without compromise, because the stakes are simply too high and the consequences too grave for anything less than absolute moral clarity.